let's get right into it. The last video ended, I was rough grinding the knife for the first time. I think I had just finished with a 60 grit grind on the bevels, and I've moved on to 120 grit belt. And basically I'm just trying to get the bevels cleaned up enough to where I can move on to hand sanding them. You can use as many different grits and belts as you want, but I typically go maybe 120 or 220 and then move on to hand sanding. I use the water to periodically cool off the blade. It gets pretty hot pretty quickly, especially the thinner it gets as you grind. And I'm moving on to a 220 grit belt. And if you'll recall, I started out hollow grinding this blade and then moved on to a flat grind. That's typically my process, and there you can kind of see we got some pretty deep grind lines, but something we can take care of hand sanding later on. And here we are moving on to hand sanding. Put a little bit of tape down just to protect the blade from getting scratched on the angle iron. And that's a little T-handle clamp a friend of mine made a few years ago. That's a super handy little tool, but a C-clamp would work just as well. And I use WD-40 as a lubricant for hand sanding, and I use it for anything under 400 grit. Once I hit 400 grit and above, I typically move on to using Windex. But I'll spend quite a bit of time with the lower grit papers like typically I'll use 120 grit sandpaper and WD-40 to do most of the hand sanding. Once you get all your scratches out and your bevel's flat with 120 grit, moving on from there, it goes pretty quickly. It's just that first initial finish with 120 grit that seems to be the most time consuming. And here's what we're looking at so far. You can see it's starting to get pretty flat. Quite a few of the scratches are starting to come out, but I've got a long way to go. And here I'm going to go ahead and lay out where I will drill the holes for my pins to hold the scales on my knife. And for this knife I'm just going to use two 1/4 inch brass pins, and you'll see me trying to find center on these using just a small machinist ruler and a carbide tipped stylus. And it's pretty good for just etching lines in the blue Dychem layout fluid. And something to keep in mind is the end of your scales, where they will stop towards the blade and then where they'll stop towards the butt of the knife. You don't want your pins to be too close to the ends. And here I am, I'll be using an automatic center punch to put little indentations for the drill bit to cut into. It's a pretty handy little tool, and if this doesn't work, I'll typically grab a heavier center punch. And here I am drilling the initial holes. This bit I'm using is a center drill. A machinist friend of mine got me turned on to these a few years ago. I go through a lot fewer of these center drills than I do regular drill bits, so I do recommend giving them a try if you never have. If you have a better drill press, you'd probably be able to get a lot more out of these bits than I do, but even with my kind of sorry drill press, it works pretty well. And moving on to the lower hole. And I'll move on to using a larger center drill. This is just kind of to give some additional holes for epoxy to move into the knife handle, and it might help with weight reduction a little bit, but mostly it's to just give some places for the epoxy to go. They kind of act like little mechanical fasteners once you get epoxy down in all these little holes. It seems to help quite a bit in avoiding having your scales raise up on the far edges, which can happen if you're not dead flat with your handle material and with your steel. I think these bits came from McMaster-Carr, and they are very good quality bits from my experience. And there you can see all the holes that I put in this handle. And now I'll be doing some final kind of cleanup on the profile. I just want to get this little area squared up and cleaned up before it gets hardened. Little details like cleaning areas up like that make a huge difference in the overall look of the knife. And if you use really good quality files, you can really get a nice finish on them before moving on to hand sanding. And that's pretty much what I do as far as the profile of the knife. I'm not too concerned. And here I am getting ready for heat treat. I've got my Parks 50 quench oil getting up to temperature. I'm using a few heavy pieces of scrap steel to heat the oil up and get it warmed up to temperature. And I'm running the knife through a few heat cycles to normalize before quenching the blade in the oil. And I've run it through 3 of these normalizing cycles before I finally quench to harden the blade. And here it is hardened, and you can hear this file skating off the blade. And we're moving over to the wire wheel to knock some scale off from quenching. And we'll also get a little bit of scale off the bevels, so when I temper the blade, you'll be able to see the oxidizing of the blade and kind of judge how your heat treat's coming along. I'm looking for a pretty deep bronze when it comes out of the oven. And you can see I'm just using a pretty cheap toaster oven at this time to temper my knives. And I run this one at 375 and temper for around 2 hours. And I cool the blade off, and you can kind of see the color when I lift it up out of the water. It's really hard to capture the color that I'm looking for, but it's pretty bronze. And back to the wire wheel to remove scale and just get some crud out of the blade. And now we're doing a little bit of hand sanding on the profile, just trying to get to maybe a 120 grit finish and get all the deep file marks out of the spine. And like I mentioned in my last video, I typically use that planer blade for some of my really hard initial sanding. It's just a dull planer blade with some masking tape on it and 120 grit paper. I decided to go back to the grinder with a higher grit belt before I continue hand sanding the bevels. Some of those scratches that I saw just seemed a little bit too aggressive to continue hand sanding. But you can end up saving quite a bit of time at the grinder before you move on to spending a whole lot of time trying to dig out really deep scratches. And I've moved on to the Scotch-Brite belt. I really like the finish this belt gives and end up using it all the time. I think it's a blue Scotch-Brite. And you can see the finish of the knife after the Scotch-Brite belt. It makes quite a bit of difference. And all the deep scratches are gone, and I should be able to move on to hand sanding from here without much issue. And when I get back to hand sanding this time, I can use a sanding block with a little bit softer face on it. Leather works pretty well, and some stiff rubbers or pads. Pretty much any kind of durable material that you glue to your sanding block will probably hold up at least enough for you to get an idea of what to use and what not to use. I've used gasket material and leather and just all sorts of different materials to just start out with a pretty firm backing and then move on to softer materials as you move up in grit. And that is as far as we'll make it this week. Thanks for watching.